How can you draw attention to a subject without always bumping exposure? In the last vlog, we covered light painting, a powerful post-processing technique that starts from a cool, dark image and highlights only the important elements. Make sure to catch up on last week's vlog in the description. Although exposure is a powerful way to begin light painting, it's only effective in small doses. You don't want to dodge everything. Local exposure adjustments are ineffective for smaller regions, and liberal dodging tends to look fake, especially in a thumbnail. That's because bumping exposure tends to scrunch together tonal details and crushes dynamic range in the regions of interest, which means there's less detail and contrast in the region that should be capturing the most interest and scrutiny. It also tends to create visible halos when viewed as a thumbnail. But once you've identified the composition, shapes, and lighting of the image, you can apply some alternative adjustments to highlight the subjects. Here are 5 alternatives to dodging that will help you bring a photo to life with light painting. To demonstrate, I'll be using this image of Piazza San Carlo in Torino, Italy. The first way that we can highlight areas within a photo without exposure is white balance. I'm going to grab my radial brush, and I am going to warm up just the regions within the photo a little bit. So I'm going to warm it up by about 10 degrees. Now that didn't make a huge difference. So it's not just what you bring out, it's what you downplay. So I'm also going to grab a second radial brush to cool the rest of the image. Remember that when you're light painting, not only do you want to play up the regions that are supposed to draw interest, you need to downplay the areas that are stealing that attention. So I'm going to do an inverted brush and cool it by about 15 degrees Kelvin. So that way, the sides of the buildings and the exterior steal less attention, which coincidentally brings out more color here in the center just by the rule of contrast. That's because regions of neutral tones tend to cognitively set our expectations of what the color white and other neutral tones should look like in an image. So by cooling the exterior and warming the interior, we begin to see the difference between the two, and our eye naturally gravitates towards the warmer region, being the center. The second way that you can draw attention to an area is to increase the saturation. I'm going to grab yet another radial filter here, and I'm going to increase the saturation on just the region of the street here and a little bit of the road that leads into it. Let me drag this up to around 30 or 20. Now you have to be careful with this because when you bump up the saturation too much, the colors tend to look clipped. But in this case, what happens is it brings out more of the beautiful oranges, yellows, and blues in the center region. However, there's also some regions competing. You may notice that down here we have this neon sign, which is stealing quite a bit of attention, and is also not in our color palette necessarily. So I would do exactly the opposite to downplay it. I'm going to bring down the saturation so that way it steals a little less attention and the eye is more naturally led to the center region. So remember, with any of these effects, you can either upplay the region of interest that you analyzed, or you can downplay things outside of it, so that way they don't compete. The third way that you can bring out a region is to bring up just the shadows. This is especially effective in regions where you've already got quite a bit of highlight detail, and you also have some dark shadow detail that's maybe a little bit overdone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the shadows just here along the street, and I want to bring out some of those arches a little bit. Now notice as I do this, that even some of the shadowy colors, like this blue up here, is starting to come out. It's giving it kind of a nice subtle halo effect without being too prominent in the thumbnail. Notice when we look at the thumbnail, it still looks fairly realistic. So bumping up the shadows tends to bring out some of these gorgeous colors, especially if you've taken a night shot and there's a strong source of light nearby. Well, those light sources may very well be in the shadows range, and so bumping it up will bring out this natural halo without affecting the highlights or overblowing the bright light sources. And of course, the exact opposite applies here as always. If I pull out my radial brush again, I'm going to do an inverted one. And to draw less attention to the exterior of this photo without looking too fakey, I'm going to bring down the shadows slider, so that way just the outside of the photo tends to draw your attention less. Now notice that it doesn't affect the highlights along these buildings too much. They're still pretty well lit, but now they're darkened a little bit without being overbearing. Notice if I were to take the exposure down, up to a point it looks great, but if you do it too much, it starts to look very fake on the thumbnail. The fourth way that you can draw attention to regions of interest is to play up the contrast in the region. So I'm going to come here mostly to the side of the building and the lights, and I'm not going to touch exposure too much. I'm going to push contrast first on just this region. Now when I bump the contrast, notice that it pushes the brights not too much, but it does bring down the shadows and it tends to oversaturate the colors. So I tend to use contrast in conjunction with exposure. So I'm going to bump up the exposure by 0.3, and then to bring back some of the tonal details, I'm going to bump up exposure. So this is after, and this is before. A subtle difference, but what you should notice is that there's more vibrant colors in the shadows of the arches, and that the lights seem to have a little bit more dynamic range, and yet they're not clipped. That's because it effectively draws down a little bit of the tones while still leaving the whites and the highlights just a little bit higher than they were before. So whenever I use contrast, I almost always use it in conjunction with exposure. Between the two, it tends to increase the tonal range in that area. And finally, my favorite and last way to bring interest to an area is to bump up the whites. This arch down here is a fantastic part of the architecture, but if you just paint in exposure, it tends to look a little bit flat because we lose some tonal details. So maybe instead of just bumping up the exposure, I'm going to bump up the whites on this. Whites tend to add brilliance to a photo without affecting your shadows, highlights, and blacks. So here's after, and here's before. To finish this off, I'm going to also do a little bit of step one, and that is adding a stronger white balance. And when I do this, it's really going to start to pop. Here's before, and here's after. So now what it does is it draws a little bit more interest to this shape here, the arches. Remember, if you haven't identified the shapes, the composition, and lighting of your image, you might accidentally light paint the wrong things. So make sure to check out the link in the description to identify those 3 key elements in an image. That is composition, shapes, and lighting. I often bump the global whites just a little bit, but I try to reserve it where possible. So in many of my images, I don't ever touch the whites, or the blacks for that matter, so that way I can use it just to bring out or downplay regions without fighting the global whites. Now there are 2 adjustments that I rarely use when trying to light paint a region, and that is clarity and blacks. I rarely use clarity because it tends to increase micro contrast, which tends to create very busy textures. It also tends to desaturate colors. So although clarity tends to increase that contrast, which draws your eye there, unfortunately it desaturates the color. These 2 effects end up fighting each other and downplaying the effect, just making it look fake. I also rarely touch blacks. Straight out of the camera, the blacks typically look spot on, and if I make them too dark, it just tends to look inky. Very few things are solid black, so I prefer not to have a true solid black. In contrast to dodge and burn, light painting can be accomplished several ways, all with the same purpose of attracting attention to the primary regions of interest. Instead of being limited to exposure, you can use a combination of white balance, saturation, shadows, contrast, and whites to draw interest to a region or downplay unimportant areas by applying the reverse effect. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for the latest digital nomad tips, landscape photography tutorials, and on-location travel vlogs.